The morning mist clung to the platform at Millbrook Station as 23-year-old Charlotte Winters stepped off the westbound train, her worn leather suitcase trembling in her grip. 3,000 miles from Boston, she had come to marry a man she'd never met, carrying nothing but a faded photograph and a promise that had seemed like salvation 6 months ago. But as the conductor's whistle pierced the September air, Charlotte felt something she hadn't expected, the overwhelming urge to run. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The correspondence had begun innocently enough. Charlotte's older sister Margaret had found the advertisement tucked between the pages of a discarded newspaper at the textile mill where they both worked 16-hour days for pennies. A respectable gentleman seeks a companionate wife. Western Territories. Good character is essential. Write to Samuel Harrison, Cedar Falls, Montana Territory. You should write to him, Charlie, Margaret had whispered during their brief lunch break, her fingers still stained with indigo dye. What future do we have here? Father's debts will follow us forever, and Mother. She hadn't needed to finish. Their mother's laudanum addiction had worsened since their father's death in a factory accident, leaving them to shoulder both grief and financial ruin. Charlotte had initially dismissed the idea. She was educated unusual for a woman of her station and had harbored dreams of becoming a teacher. But dreams, she'd learned, were luxuries the poor couldn't afford. When the mill announced wage cuts that autumn of 1883, those dreams seemed as distant as the Montana mountains she'd only read about in books. The first letter from Samuel Harrison arrived on a Tuesday. His penmanship was careful, refined, and his words painted a picture of a life Charlotte had never dared imagine. He owned a prosperous ranch outside Cedar Falls, he wrote, with cattle that grazed on endless grasslands beneath skies so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. He was 31, 7 years her senior, and sought a wife not from loneliness but from a desire to build something meaningful, a family, a legacy, a partnership based on mutual respect. I am not seeking a servant, he had written in his second letter, but a companion. Someone who might find joy in this untamed land as I have, who might help me transform a house into a home. His photograph showed a man with serious dark eyes and strong hands standing beside a well-built log house with mountains rising in the background like sleeping giants. There was something in his expression, not harsh, but weathered by experience, as if he understood hardship but hadn't let it embitter him. Over the months that followed, their correspondence deepened. Samuel wrote of his struggles establishing the ranch, of losses endured and lessons learned. He'd lost his previous homestead to drought 3 years prior, he confided, and had rebuilt from nothing with determination that bordered on stubbornness. Charlotte found herself sharing her own dreams, her love of books, her desire to teach children, her secret hope that education might be the key to breaking cycles of poverty and desperation. There is a schoolhouse in Cedar Falls, Samuel had written in response. It sits empty most months, as few families have settled permanently. Perhaps in time, you might find purpose there as well as in our home. The proposal came in April, formal but warm. Samuel offered not just marriage but partnership, a chance to help build something lasting in a land where the past couldn't follow and the future remained unwritten. He enclosed funds for travel and a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, a woman who had crossed similar distances to marry his father decades earlier. Charlotte had accepted, though something deep in her chest fluttered with uncertainty she couldn't name. The journey west had taken 6 days, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar. She'd shared train cars with farmers heading to new homesteads, gamblers drifting toward boomtowns, and other mail-order brides whose stories echoed her own women fleeing poverty, scandal, or simply the suffocating limitations of Eastern propriety. Some chattered nervously about their intended husbands. Others sat in contemplative silence, their eyes fixed on landscapes that grew increasingly wild and untamed. Martha Henley, a widow from Philadelphia traveling to marry a shopkeeper in Wyoming, had befriended Charlotte during the journey. She was older, perhaps 40, with silver threading through auburn hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. "I married for love the first time," Martha had confided as they watched the Nebraska plains roll past their window. "Edward was gentle, kind, everything I thought I wanted. But gentleness doesn't pay bills or protect you from the world's sharp edges. This time, I'm choosing security over romance. It feels less foolish somehow." Charlotte had nodded, though privately. She wondered if she was being foolish in a different way. Samuel's letters had stirred something in her that felt dangerously close to affection, perhaps even love. Was it naive to hope that their arrangement might grow into something deeper? Or was she setting herself up for disappointment by expecting more than a practical partnership? Now standing on the platform at Millbrook Station, those doubts crashed over her like a wave. The Montana landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful but alien, without a single familiar landmark to anchor her sense of place. The air smelled of sage and something wild she couldn't identify, and the silence felt profound after years of city noise.
The morning mist clung to the platform at Millbrook Station as 23-year-old Charlotte Winters stepped off the westbound train, her worn leather suitcase trembling in her grip. 3,000 miles from Boston, she had come to marry a man she'd never met, carrying nothing but a faded photograph and a promise that had seemed like salvation 6 months ago. But as the conductor's whistle pierced the September air, Charlotte felt something she hadn't expected, the overwhelming urge to run. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The correspondence had begun innocently enough. Charlotte's older sister Margaret had found the advertisement tucked between the pages of a discarded newspaper at the textile mill where they both worked 16-hour days for pennies. "A respectable gentleman seeks a companionate wife. Western Territories. Good character is essential. Write to Samuel Harrison, Cedar Falls, Montana Territory." "You should write to him, Charlie," Margaret had whispered during their brief lunch break, her fingers still stained with indigo dye. "What future do we have here? Father's debts will follow us forever, and Mother—" She hadn't needed to finish. Their mother's laudanum addiction had worsened since their father's death in a factory accident, leaving them to shoulder both grief and financial ruin. Charlotte had initially dismissed the idea. She was educated, unusual for a woman of her station, and had harbored dreams of becoming a teacher. But dreams, she'd learned, were luxuries the poor couldn't afford. When the mill announced wage cuts that autumn of 1883, those dreams seemed as distant as the Montana mountains she'd only read about in books. The first letter from Samuel Harrison arrived on a Tuesday. His penmanship was careful, refined, and his words painted a picture of a life Charlotte had never dared to imagine. He owned a prosperous ranch outside Cedar Falls, he wrote, with cattle that grazed on endless grasslands beneath skies so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. He was 31, 7 years her senior, and sought a wife not from loneliness, but from a desire to build something meaningful, a family, a legacy, a partnership based on mutual respect. "I am not seeking a servant, but a companion, someone who might find joy in this untamed land as I have, who might help me transform a house into a home." His photograph showed a man with serious dark eyes and strong hands standing beside a well-built log house with mountains rising in the background like sleeping giants. There was something in his expression, not harsh, but weathered by experience, as if he understood hardship but hadn't let it embitter him.
A few other passengers disembarked, a traveling salesman with a worn carpetbag, an elderly couple who seemed to know exactly where they were going, and a young man in a dusty coat who immediately began unloading crates from the freight car. Charlotte stood frozen, scanning the small crowd gathered at the platform's edge, her heart hammered as she searched for Samuel's face among the strangers. Would he look like his photograph? Would she recognize him? More importantly, would he approve of her? She'd worn her best-dressed navy wool with pearl buttons that had been her mother's, and had spent the morning braiding and rebraiding her chestnut hair, trying to achieve the composed appearance of a woman ready for marriage and frontier life. Minutes passed. The platform cleared as people found their parties or headed toward the town proper. Charlotte remained, her suitcase growing heavier in her grip, doubt spreading through her chest like spilled ink. Had Samuel forgotten, changed his mind? Had her letters revealed something that made him reconsider their arrangement? "Miss Winters?" The voice came from behind her, deep and careful. Charlotte turned to find a man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, with those same serious dark eyes from the photograph, but somehow more striking in person. Samuel Harrison, her intended husband, but something was wrong. His expression held concern rather than welcome, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone bearing difficult news. "Mr. Harrison," she managed, attempting a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "I was beginning to worry. Miss Winters, we need to talk." Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. "There's been a complication." Charlotte's stomach dropped. After traveling 3,000 miles, after burning her bridges in Boston, after investing every hope in this new beginning, what complication could possibly justify the regret she saw in his eyes? "I don't understand," she said quietly. Samuel glanced around the now empty platform, then gestured toward a wooden bench beneath the station's overhang. "Please, sit with me for a moment." Charlotte's legs felt unsteady as she followed him. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the mist and revealing the town of Cedar Falls in the distance smaller than she'd imagined. Just a handful of buildings clustered around what appeared to be a main street. Beyond it, the landscape rolled away in waves of gold and green toward mountains that looked both magnificent and impossibly remote. "Miss Winters, Charlotte, I need to tell you something that should have been in my letters, but wasn't." Samuel's hands were clasped tightly. In front of him, his knuckles white with tension. "My situation has changed considerably since we began our correspondence." The words hit her like a physical blow. He was married, or bankrupt, or dying. Something that made their arrangement impossible after she'd already sacrificed everything to be here. 3 weeks ago, Samuel continued, his voice low, "I received word that my ranch has been claimed by the Broken Arrow Mining Company. They hold debt papers from the previous owner, debt I wasn't aware of when I purchased the land. Legal challenges could take years and cost money I don't have. As of yesterday, I'm no longer a rancher. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I'm nobody, Charlotte. I have nothing to offer you except apologies and enough money to return to Boston if you choose." Charlotte stared at him, her mind reeling. This was worse than she'd imagined, not rejection, but the collapse of everything he'd promised, everything she'd hoped for. The house in the photograph, the cattle, the schoolhouse, the future they'd planned through careful letters, all of it gone. "I should have telegraphed," Samuel said. "Should have stopped you from making the journey. But I kept hoping I could find a solution. Some way to salvage ... Bull quotes." He shook his head. "There is no solution. I've lost everything, and I have no right to ask you to share in that loss." The silence stretched between them. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely in the vast sky. Charlotte felt something breaking inside her chest, not just disappointment, but a deeper fracture, as if the foundation of her world had shifted irrevocably. "What will you do?" she asked finally. Samuel's laugh was bitter. "I honestly don't know. Find work somewhere, I suppose. Start over." He looked at her with genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Charlotte, truly sorry. You deserved better than this, better than me." Charlotte stood abruptly, her suitcase falling to the platform with a dull thud. The sound seemed to echo off the empty buildings, a punctuation mark to the end of her dreams. She walked to the platform's edge, looking out at the alien landscape that was supposed to have been her new home. Behind her, she heard Samuel rise, probably preparing to escort her back to the train, to arrange her return journey, to close this chapter as efficiently as possible. But Charlotte found herself thinking not of Boston, of the mill, of Margaret's worried face, of their mother's glazed eyes and empty laudanum bottles, but of something Samuel had written in one of his early letters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This land doesn't forgive weakness, he'd said, but it rewards those brave enough to face it honestly. She turned back to him, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Mr. Harrison, what kind of work are you looking for? Samuel blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Anything, I suppose. I'm good with my hands. Strong enough for manual labor. There might be work at the mines, or with one of the cattle outfits further north. And what about me? What are my options? He looked uncomfortable. As I said, I have enough saved to send you back to Boston. It's the least I can do after. That wasn't what I asked. Charlotte picked up her suitcase, weighing it in her hand. Everything she owned in the world, condensed into one worn leather case. I asked about my options, not your obligations. Samuel studied her face, something shifting in his expression. I don't understand. You said there was a schoolhouse in town. Empty most of the time. Yes, but Charlotte, is there work for women here? Besides teaching? Some. The hotel needs help, and there's talk of starting a newspaper. Mrs. Chun, who runs the general store, has been looking for assistance since her daughter moved to Denver. But these aren't opportunities for a lady of my what? Charlotte's voice carried an edge she hadn't known she possessed. Mr. Harrison, I worked 16 hours a day in a textile mill. My hands have been stained with dye more often than they've been clean. I'm not afraid of work. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those serious dark eyes. Around them, the morning was growing warmer, and Charlotte could hear the distant sounds of Cedar Falls awakening horses and wagons, voices calling greetings, the everyday noise of a community starting its day. Charlotte, Samuel said finally. What are you suggesting? She wasn't entirely sure herself. The practical part of her mind, the part that had calculated budgets and managed household finances since her father's death, screamed that she should take his offer and return to Boston. Cut her losses before they grew worse. Except that some dreams were too ambitious for women like her. But another part of her, a part that had been awakening during the long train journey west, whispered something different. She had traveled 3,000 miles to escape one set of limitations. Why should she accept another? I'm suggesting, she said slowly, that perhaps we both came here looking for the wrong thing. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the focused attention of a man trying to solve a puzzle. What do you mean? Charlotte set down her suitcase deliberately, as if the action itself was a decision. You wrote to find a wife because you wanted to build something lasting. I answered because I wanted to escape a life that was slowly killing me. But neither of us was looking for a partner in the truest sense, someone who could stand beside you when everything falls apart. The words surprised her as she spoke them. She hadn't consciously formed these thoughts during the journey, yet they emerged with startling clarity, as if the Montana air itself was burning away pretense. Charlotte, I appreciate what you're trying to say, but I have nothing left to offer. Neither do one. She gestured toward her single suitcase. Everything I owned in Boston fits in that bag. My family's debts will outlive me. I have no prospects, no dowry, no connections. By any practical measure, I'm as ruined as you are. Samuel stood slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been hope. Then what are you proposing? That we stop thinking like people with something to lose and start thinking like people with everything to gain. Charlotte turned toward the town, shading her eyes against the climbing sun. You said Mrs. Chun needs help at the general store. That's work, steady pay. The schoolhouse sits empty. That's an opportunity someone with teaching ambitions might seize. You mentioned mining work, cattle ranches. This territory is growing, which means there are needs to be filled by people smart enough to see them. You want to stay in Cedar Falls? I want to make a choice based on possibility rather than fear. Charlotte faced him again, surprised by her own certainty. In Boston, my future was written before I was born, work myself to death in the mills, or marry someone equally trapped and watch my children do the same. Here, at least, the future is unwritten. Samuel was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving between Charlotte's face and the town beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, less defeated, more thoughtful. It wouldn't be easy. Winter comes early in the mountains, and it's harsh. The nearest doctor is 50 miles south in Helena. If something goes wrong, something already went wrong. Your ranch, my family, everything we planned, it's all gone. The question is whether we let that destroy us or teach us. A slow smile tugged at the corner of Samuel's mouth, the first she'd seen from him. You're not what I expected, Charlotte Winters. Neither are you. She picked up her suitcase again, this time with purpose. So, Mr. Harrison, shall we introduce ourselves to Cedar Falls? The walk to town took 20 minutes along a dusty road lined with cottonwoods and wild roses. Samuel carried Charlotte's suitcase despite her protests, and as they walked, he began pointing out landmarks with growing enthusiasm, the creek that ran year-round, the meadow where wild strawberries grew in summer, the stand of pines where deer came to drink at dawn. You know this area well, Charlotte observed. I've been exploring since I arrived last spring. When you own land, you need to understand what's around it. Water sources, game trails, which ranchers are friendly and which might cause trouble. His expression darkened briefly. A lot of good that knowledge does me now. Knowledge is never wasted. It just finds new applications. Cedar Falls proved larger than it had appeared from the train platform. The main street boasted a hotel, a saloon, Chun's general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and several buildings under construction. People moved with the purposeful energy of a community that expected to grow, their clothes practical rather than fashionable, their faces weathered by sun and wind. That's the Silver Dollar, Samuel said, nodding toward the hotel. Mrs. Kowalski runs it. She came from Poland 15 years ago with nothing but determination and a recipe for pierogi that keeps the miners coming back. If she has work available, she's fair but demanding. They paused in front of Chun's general store, a well-maintained building with large windows displaying everything from bolts of fabric to farming tools. Through the glass, Charlotte could see a small woman with graying hair arranging items on shelves with methodical precision. Mrs. Chun, Samuel explained, lost her husband in a mining accident 2 years ago. She could have sold out and moved back to San Francisco, where her family lives, but she stayed. Says Cedar Falls needs her more than California does. Charlotte studied the woman's movements, efficient, confident, purposeful. She looks like someone who understands hard work. That she does. Samuel hesitated. Charlotte, are you certain about this? Once we walk through that door, there's no going back. People will have questions, expectations. What kind of expectations? They'll assume we're married or about to be. In a town this size, a single woman staying alone. It raises eyebrows, creates talk. Not necessarily harmful talk, but talk nonetheless. Charlotte considered this. The social conventions of frontier towns were different from those she'd known in Boston. but human nature remained constant. An unmarried woman living independently would be viewed with curiosity at best, suspicion at worst. What do you suggest? Samuel looked uncomfortable. That is, if you're still willing, we could proceed with the original arrangement. Marriage in name at least. Separate living situations initially, if you prefer. It would protect your reputation while you establish yourself. The proposal was practical, even considerate, but Charlotte found herself hesitating. Marriage, even a marriage of convenience, implied commitment she wasn't ready to make to a man she'd known for less than an hour. Or, Samuel continued, seeing her hesitation, you could stay at the hotel initially. Mrs. Kowalski rents rooms by the week to respectable working women. It's more expensive, but it would give you independence while you decide what you want to do. Charlotte weighed the options. Marriage offered social protection, but personal complications. Independence offered freedom, but potential isolation in a community where connections mattered. Both choices carried risks. Let me ask Mrs. Kowalski about room rates, she decided. I'd rather start with independence and earn respect than begin with protection and wonder if I've earned anything at all. Samuel's expression showed something that might have been admiration. Very well, but first, let's speak with Mrs. Chun about work. No sense making plans without knowing if they're feasible. The general store's interior was organized chaos shelves, packed with goods from floor to ceiling. Barrels of flour and beans, bolts of fabric, tools, medicines, books, and a dozen other categories of merchandise. The scent of coffee, leather, and something spicy Charlotte couldn't identify filled the air. Mrs. Chun looked up from her inventory list as they entered, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. She was smaller than she'd appeared through the window, but her presence filled the space around her. Samuel Harrison, she said, her voice carrying a slight accent and a wealth of concern. I heard about your troubles with the mining company. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I'd like you to meet Miss Charlotte Winters. She just arrived from Boston. Mrs. Chun's gaze moved to Charlotte, taking in everything from her travel-worn dress to the confident way she met eye contact. Boston, long journey, yes. Ma'am, Mr. Harrison mentioned you might have needed assistance here. Might. Mrs. Chun set down her inventory list, folding her hands in front of her. What kind of assistance do you think you can provide? Charlotte glanced around the store, her mind cataloging the organized complexity of the operation. I can read and write well, keep accurate records, and handle correspondence. I've managed household budgets and helped with inventory at my family's boarding house. I'm comfortable with numbers and good with customers. You know anything about frontier merchandise? Mining supplies, ranching equipment, household goods for women who make soap from scratch? No, ma'am, but I'm willing to learn. Mrs. Chun picked up a bolt of blue cotton, running her fingers along the weave. In San Francisco, my sister manages a store twice this size. She has 3 assistants, all experienced, all trained. She writes letters asking me to sell this place and come work for her. She looked directly at Charlotte. Why should I hire someone who knows nothing about my business instead of accepting her offer? The question was blunt, but not unfriendly, a test of Charlotte's reasoning rather than a rejection. Charlotte considered carefully before responding. Because your sister's assistants work for wages in a business they'll never own. They have no stake in its success beyond their weekly pay. But someone starting fresh in a growing town, someone with nowhere else to go and everything to prove, that person has reasons to succeed that go beyond money. Mrs. Chun was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she moved to a different section of the store, gesturing for Charlotte to follow. This is our book and stationery section, she said. Paper, ink, envelopes, the few books I can get shipped reliably. Most people here are too tired for read, but school teachers, clerks, women who write letters to family back east, they need supplies. Last month, I sold nothing from this section, 0. Charlotte examined the selection. Basic supplies. A few. Classic novels, some practical manuals on farming and household management. The arrangement was functional, but uninspiring. May I ask why you think sales are poor? People don't know what I have. They come for flour and nails, they don't think. To look at books. And honestly, selection isn't very good. I order what I think might sell, but I don't really know books. What if someone could improve the selection and find ways to draw attention to it? Maybe arrange the books more attractively. Create displays that catch the eye, even host occasional reading events for families. Mrs. Chun's eyebrows rose slightly. Reading events? Nothing elaborate. An evening where people could browse the books, hear excerpts from new arrivals, discuss what they've read. It would bring people into the store for reasons other than necessities, and once they're here. Charlotte gestured toward the rest of the merchandise. They might buy other things. Mrs. Chun nodded slowly. Interesting idea. You have experience organizing such events? Not exactly, but I've helped with church socials and literary society meetings. The principle is similar. Give people a reason to gather, make them comfortable, let natural interest do the rest. Samuel had remained silent during this exchange, but Charlotte could feel his attention, his assessment of how she was handling herself. Mrs. Chun, meanwhile, was studying Charlotte with the focused intensity of someone solving a practical problem. Housing, Mrs. Chun said finally. If I hire you, where will you live? Samuel's ranch is gone, and you're not married. I plan to inquire about room rates at the hotel. Hotel's expensive for working wages. And Mrs. Kowalski, she's a good woman. But she likes things quiet. Reading events, people coming and going, she might not approve. Charlotte felt her first flicker of uncertainty. She hadn't considered that her ideas might create complications beyond her control. However, Mrs. Chun continued, I have rooms above the store. The small apartment I used when I first arrived. Basic furniture, kitchen facilities. I moved to a house after my husband died, but the apartment's still there. Could be arranged as part of employment terms. The offer was unexpected and generous, solving multiple problems at once. But Charlotte had learned to examine good fortune carefully. It often came with hidden costs. That's very kind, Mrs. Chun. What would you expect in return? Reliable work, honest dealing, and success with those book events you mentioned. Also, help during busy seasons, cattle drives, mining paydays, times when store gets crowded, and... She paused, seeming to weigh her words. Understanding that small-town people talk. Unmarried women living alone above the store. They'll have opinions. You need to be prepared for that. Charlotte thought of the conversation she'd endured in Boston, whispered speculation about her family's finances, pointed questions about her unmarried status, the constant judgment of people who measured worth by conventional standards. She'd hoped to escape that scrutiny, but apparently it followed unmarried women everywhere. I understand, Mrs. Chun. I've dealt with talk before. Good. Then we try arranging for 1 month. If it works for both of us, we discuss permanent terms. Fair wages, room and board, percentage of profits from any new initiatives that succeed. Acceptable? Charlotte looked at Samuel, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then back at Mrs. Chun. A month wasn't long, but it was a beginning, more opportunity than she'd had in Boston, more independence than she'd dared hope for even that morning. Very acceptable. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow morning. Store opens at 7. Today you get settled, look around town, meet people. Samuel can show you around, introduce you properly. Mrs. Chun returned to her inventory list, then looked up again. One more thing. You mentioned teaching experience. Our schoolhouse, it's been empty for 6 months. Previous teacher got married, moved to Denver. School board's been looking for a replacement, but candidates they've found ... double quotes, she shrugged. Not suitable. If you're interested in teaching as well as store work, might be worth speaking with Mayor Patterson. Charlotte felt excitement flutter in her chest. Teaching had been her original dream, the goal that had seemed impossible in Boston's competitive market. Here was the possibility of pursuing it alongside her store work. I would be very interested. Thank you for mentioning it. As they left the store, Samuel was grinning. That went better than I expected. Mrs. Chun doesn't offer jobs lightly, and she certainly doesn't offer housing to people she's just met. She seems like a good judge of character. She is. Her husband used to say she could read people's intentions in their handwriting. Samuel's expression grew more serious. Charlotte, I want you to know what you did there. The way you handled yourself, it was impressive. Most people coming from the back east expect things to be handed to them. You earned that opportunity. They walked toward the hotel, Charlotte's mind already racing with ideas for the bookstore section and questions about the teaching position. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt not just hope but genuine excitement about the future. The Silver Dollar Hotel was a substantial 3-story building with a wide front porch and windows that had actually been washed recently. Mrs. Kowalski proved to be a sturdy woman in her 50s with graying blonde hair and hands that suggested she wasn't afraid of physical work. Room and board runs $8 a week, she explained as she showed Charlotte a clean, simply furnished room on the second floor. That includes breakfast and supper, laundry service, and use of the sitting room downstairs. No gentlemen visitors. Above the first floor, no drinking in the rooms, no noise after 10 o'clock. Charlotte calculated quickly. Even with generous wages from Mrs. Chun, $8 weekly would consume most of her earnings. But Mrs. Chun's offer of rooms above the store eliminated this concern. Thank you for showing me the accommodations, Mrs. Kowalski. They're very nice. However, Mrs. Chun has offered me housing as part of my employment at the store. Mrs. Kowalski's expression shifted to one of understanding mixed with approval. Ah, you're the new assistant she mentioned needing. Good choice, both ways, Mrs. Chun's fair to work for, and living above the store will save you money while you get established. As they returned to the street, Charlotte realized the afternoon was advancing toward evening. The town had grown busier as the day progressed, miners finishing their shifts, ranchers conducting business, women completing shopping before preparing supper for their families. Where are you staying? Charlotte asked Samuel as they walked back toward the general store. Boarding house on the edge of town. Run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher. Basic accommodations but clean and cheap. He glanced at her sideways. What happens now, Charlotte? We came here planning one future, and now we're improvising another. Are you comfortable with whatever this is? Charlotte considered the question. What was this exactly? They weren't strangers anymore, but they weren't quite friends either. They weren't married, but their lives had become intertwined in ways she couldn't fully define. They were two people who had reached for something and missed, then decided to reach for something else entirely. I think, she said slowly, that we're two people who discovered they're braver than they knew. Beyond that, I suppose we'll figure it out as we go. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Chun mentioned introducing you around town. Would you like to meet some of the other business owners? The mayor? It might be good to establish yourself before people start creating their own stories about who you are and why you're here. The suggestion made practical sense, but Charlotte found herself hesitating. She was tired from travel, overwhelmed by the day's unexpected turns, and uncertain how to present herself to a community that would inevitably be curious about her circumstances. Actually, she said, I think I'd rather spend this evening settling in and thinking through what I want to say when I meet people. First impressions matter, and I'd prefer to make them when I'm prepared. Of course, Mrs. Chun said you could move into the apartment above the store immediately. Shall I help you get settled? Charlotte realized she was about to spend her first night alone in a frontier town, in a building she'd never seen, far from anyone who'd known her longer than a few hours. The magnitude of what she'd undertaken hit her suddenly, not with regret, but with a mixture of excitement and terror that left her slightly breathless. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I'd appreciate that very much." The apartment above Chun's general store consisted of 3 small rooms connected by a narrow hallway, a sitting area with a cast-iron stove, a bedroom barely large enough for a single bed and washstand, and a kitchen equipped with basic necessities. The furniture was simple but well-maintained, and large windows facing the street filled the space with afternoon light. "Mrs. Chun keeps everything in good repair," Samuel observed, testing the latch on one of the windows. "These buildings look rough from the outside, but they're built to last through mountain winters." Charlotte set her suitcase on the narrow bed, then moved to the kitchen window that overlooked the alley behind the store. She could see a small garden plot, currently overgrown with weeds, and beyond that, the rooflines of other buildings stepping down toward the creek Samuel had pointed out earlier. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The space was hers, not shared with sisters or boarders, not subject to a landlord's whims or a husband's preferences. For the first time in her life, she could arrange her surroundings exactly as she chose. Samuel remained near the door, clearly uncertain whether to stay or leave. "I should let you get settled. Will you be all right here tonight? Alone, I mean?" The question carried concern rather than judgment, but it reminded Charlotte that her independence came with isolation. In Boston, she'd been surrounded by family, but people who knew her history and could be counted on in emergencies. Here, she was entirely on her own. "I'll be fine," she said, more confidently than she felt. "Mrs. Chun is just downstairs, and this seems like a safe town. It is, mostly. People look out for each other. But if you need anything, Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house is 3 blocks south on Elm Street. Anyone can direct you there." After Samuel left, Charlotte unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her books on a shelf beside the bed. The evening light was fading, painting the mountains purple against a sky that seemed impossibly vast after years of city horizons hemmed in by buildings. She prepared a simple supper from supplies Mrs. Chun had left: bread, cheese, preserved apples, and ate while watching the town settle into evening routines. Lamps appeared in windows, smoke rose from chimneys, and she could hear fragments of conversation from people passing in the street below. The sounds were different from Boston's urban clamor, quieter, more personal, as if she could distinguish individual lives rather than anonymous crowds. A knock at the street door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chun standing on the steps, holding a covered basket. "Thought you might need a few things for your first night," Mrs. Chun said when Charlotte opened the door. The basket contained coffee, eggs, bacon, and a loaf of bread that smelled like it had come from someone's home kitchen rather than a commercial bakery. "This is very kind, Mrs. Chun. You didn't need to call me Lily. And yes, I did need to. Tomorrow you start working for me, but tonight you're new in town with no friends and probably no idea where to buy decent food. Kindness is practical here. We all depend on each other." Charlotte invited her upstairs, and Lily examined the apartment with the critical eye of someone ensuring her investment was sound. "Stove draws well, no drafts around the windows, roof doesn't leak. You should be comfortable through winter." She paused at the kitchen window, looking down at the overgrown garden. "That plot belongs to an apartment. Previous tenant never used it, but the soil's good. You could grow vegetables, herbs, maybe flowers if you want something pretty to look at." The idea of a garden appealed to Charlotte immediately. In Boston, green space had been limited to small parks crowded with people. The possibility of growing her own food, of working with soil and seeds, seemed like another form of independence. "I'd like that very much." I don't know much about gardening, but learning's the best part. Makes you pay attention to seasons. Weather, what the land wants to give you. Lily moved to the sitting room window, gesturing toward the street. You can see most of the main street from here. Good for keeping track of customers, knowing when busy times are coming. Also good for knowing what's happening in town, who's arguing with whom, which businesses are thriving when strangers arrive. Charlotte joined her at the window. Realizing that her new home offered more than shelter, it provided a vantage point for understanding the community she was joining. Speaking of strangers, Lily continued, people will be curious about you. Young woman arriving alone, taking job and housing, no family connections. They'll want to know your story. Best to decide how much you want to tell and stick to that version. The advice was practical but also cautionary. Charlotte had fled Boston partly to escape the weight of other people's opinions, but apparently small towns came with their own forms of scrutiny. What would you suggest? Truth, but not necessarily all of it. You came west for opportunities not available back east. You have teaching experience and business skills. You're here to work and contribute to the community. Beyond that ... double quotes, Lily shrugged. People will assume what they want to assume anyway. After Lily left, Charlotte sat in her small sitting room as darkness settled over Cedar Falls. Oil lamps appeared in windows across the street, creating pools of warm light in the mountain night. The silence was profound, no factory whistles. No street vendors, no constant rumble of traffic. Just wind through the cottonwoods and the distant sound of someone playing the fiddle. She thought about Samuel's question from earlier. What was this situation they'd created? Neither marriage nor simple friendship, but something more complex, a partnership born from mutual disappointment that had somehow transformed into mutual possibility. She found herself curious about his thoughts, his plans, his adjustment to losing everything he'd worked to build. Morning came early in the mountains. Charlotte woke to sunlight streaming through east-facing windows and the sounds of a town beginning its daily routines. From her bedroom window, she could see Samuel crossing the street toward the general store, carrying what appeared to be a toolbox. By the time she'd dressed and made coffee, Lily was unlocking the store below. Charlotte descended to find Samuel examining the front porch steps, which showed signs of wear from constant foot traffic. These boards are getting loose, he was explaining to Lily. Nothing dangerous yet, but they should be reinforced before someone gets hurt. I can fix them this morning if you have the materials. Good eye, Lily replied. I've been meaning to address that but haven't had time. Materials are in the storage room behind the counter. Charlotte watched Samuel work as she helped Lily prepare the store for opening. His movements were efficient and skilled, the work of someone accustomed to solving practical problems with his hands. When he finished the repairs, the steps felt solid and looked noticeably better. What do I owe you? Lily asked. Samuel wiped his hands on a rag, looking uncomfortable. Nothing. Call it a favor between neighbors. I don't accept charity, Samuel Harrison, and I don't let good work go uncompensated. If you won't take money, then you'll accept payment in trade. Store credit or meals or... She glanced at Charlotte. Help finding other work that needs doing. Other work? Half the buildings in town need repairs, improvements, maintenance that owners either can't do themselves or don't have time for. Most folks would rather hire someone they trust than wait for traveling carpenters who might never show up. Charlotte saw the idea take hold in Samuel's expression, not just occasional odd jobs, but the possibility of establishing himself as the town's go-to craftsman for projects requiring skill and reliability. I'd appreciate any recommendations you could make, he said. Then we have an arrangement. Charlotte, ready for your first day? The morning passed quickly as Lily introduced Charlotte to the store's systems, inventory tracking, supplier relationships, customer accounts, and the delicate art of frontier commerce where cash was often scarce and bartering common. Charlotte learned that the ledger books contained not just financial records, but a complex web of community relationships, who could be trusted with credit, which families were struggling, what seasonal patterns affected different types of business. Mrs. Patterson buys fabric in spring and fall but pays in eggs and vegetables during summer. Lily explained, showing Charlotte a typical account page. Mr. Rodriguez trades horseshoeing services for tools and supplies. The widow Morrison does laundry for half the bachelors in town in exchange for store credit. How do you keep track of the value of different goods and services? Experience, mostly. And understanding what people need versus what they want. Mrs. Patterson's eggs are worth more in winter when chickens lay less. Mr. Rodriguez's work is worth more during cattle season when every horse in the territory needs shoeing. Everything fluctuates. Charlotte found the complexity fascinating rather than intimidating. This was economics on a human scale, where personal relationships and seasonal rhythms mattered as much as supply and demand. The first customers arrived mid-morning, 2 miners looking for lamp oil and tobacco, followed by a rancher's wife shopping for her weekly household supplies. Charlotte observed how Lily interacted with each customer, noting names, asking about family members, remembering previous purchases and preferences. Personal attention, Lily murmured as the rancher's wife left with her packages. In big cities, customers are anonymous. Here, they're neighbors. You remember their children's names, their husband's work, their struggles and celebrations. Makes them loyal. Around midday, a well-dressed man in his 50s entered the store, removing his hat as he approached the counter. His clothing marked him as someone of importance, a town official or successful businessman. Double quotes Mrs. Chun. Good afternoon. I hear you've hired an assistant. Mayor Patterson, meet Miss Charlotte Winters. Charlotte, this is our mayor, Thomas Patterson. Mayor Patterson studied Charlotte with the assessing gaze of a politician, taking in her appearance, demeanor, and the confidence with which she met his scrutiny. Miss Winters, welcome to Cedar Falls. Mrs. Chun tells me you have teaching experience. Yes. Sir, I assisted at a school in Boston and have always hoped to pursue teaching as a career. Interesting. Our school has been without a teacher for 6 months. The school board has interviewed several candidates, but he paused diplomatically. None proved suitable for our particular needs. What needs are those, specifically? Cedar Falls is growing rapidly, which means our student body includes children from very different backgrounds. Minors, kids who've never seen the inside of a school, ranchers' children who've been educated at home, immigrants' families where English is a second language. We need someone who can adapt to diverse needs while maintaining proper educational standards. Charlotte felt excitement building. This was exactly the kind of teaching challenge that appealed to her, not drilling lessons into passive students, but finding ways to reach children with different strengths and backgrounds. I'd be very interested in discussing the position with the school board. Excellent. I'll arrange a meeting for next week. In the meantime, you might visit the schoolhouse to see what you'd be working with. It's the white building with the bell tower, about 4 blocks north of here. After the mayor left, Lily looked pleased. Teaching and store work, you'll be busier than you expected. I don't mind being busy. I don't think too much. About what? Charlotte hesitated, then decided honesty was simpler than evasion. About whether I've made a terrible mistake, whether I'm capable of succeeding here, whether I'll end up worse off than I was in Boston. All reasonable concerns, Lily said matter-of-factly. Also useless ones. Mistake or not, you're here now. Capable or not, you'll find out by trying. Better or worse off, that depends on what you value most. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, and Charlotte began to understand the rhythm of the business. Miners stopped by after their shifts. Ranchers conducted weekly shopping trips. Women browsed fabric and household goods while their children examined a candy selection. Each interaction taught her something about the community's social dynamics and economic realities. Late in the afternoon, Samuel returned with news that he'd secured his first independent job repairing a damaged roof for the blacksmith, whose previous attempts at self-repair had only made the problem worse. "Word travels fast in small towns," he reported. 3 other people approached me about projects after they heard I was available for hire. Charlotte felt a strange pride in his success, as if their fates remained linked despite their changed circumstances. They were both building new lives, from the ruins of their original plans, both proving they could adapt and thrive despite unexpected setbacks. "That's wonderful news," she said. "It sounds like Cedar Falls needs your skills." "It does, and from what I hear, the school board is eager to meet with you about the teaching position." Mayor Patterson was impressed. As evening approached, Charlotte helped Lily close the store, learning the end-of-day routines that would become part of her regular responsibilities. They counted the day's receipts, updated account ledgers, and secured merchandise against potential theft. "How did I do?" Charlotte asked as they finished. "Better than expected. You listen well, ask good questions, handle customers naturally. Most importantly, you're not afraid of hard work or complicated situations." Lily locked the cash box, then looked directly at Charlotte. "I have good instincts about people, Miss Winters. I believe you'll succeed here." Alone in her apartment. That evening, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen, beginning a letter to her sister Margaret. How could she explain the day's events, the collapse of her marriage plans, her decision to stay in Cedar Falls, the opportunities that had emerged from apparent disaster? She wrote several drafts before settling on a version that conveyed optimism without hiding the uncertainty of her situation. Margaret would worry regardless, but at least she would understand that Charlotte was making deliberate choices rather than simply enduring circumstances. A knock at the door interrupted her writing. Through the window, she could see Samuel standing in the street, holding what appeared to be a wrapped package. "I brought supper," he explained when she opened the door. "Mrs. Fletcher made too much stew, and I thought you might be tired after your first day." The gesture was thoughtful and practical, but Charlotte sensed something more: a desire for company, for conversation with someone who understood the strangeness of their shared situation. "That's very kind. Would you like to join me?" "I was just writing to my sister, trying to explain everything that's happened." Samuel accepted the invitation, and they shared the simple meal while discussing their respective first days in their new roles. The conversation was comfortable, free of the awkwardness Charlotte might have expected given their unusual circumstances. "I keep thinking about what you said yesterday," Samuel mentioned as they finished eating. "About stopping to think like people with something to lose and starting to think like people with everything to gain. It's changing how I approach everything." "How?" "So, in the past I've been careful with risks, cautious about new ventures. Made sense when I had a ranch to protect, assets to preserve. But now," he gestured around the small apartment, "now I can afford to take chances I couldn't take before. If I fail, I'm no worse off than I am currently. If I succeed, everything is better." Charlotte understood completely. In Boston, she'd been trapped by the need to preserve what little her family had. Here, with nothing to preserve, she was free to reach for possibilities she'd never dared consider. "It's liberating in a way," she agreed. "Terrifying, but liberating." "Exactly." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Charlotte, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" "Not coming west. I can see that's working out well for you, but the original plan, the marriage arrangement?" Charlotte considered the question carefully. 24 hours ago, she'd been prepared to marry a stranger for security and convenience. Now she was building an independent life based on her own skills and determination. The transformation felt almost miraculous. "I regret the circumstances that made marriage seem like my only option," she said finally. But I don't regret the chain of events that brought me here. Even if everything had worked out as originally planned, I think I would have always wondered what I might have accomplished on my own. Samuel nodded slowly. I feel something similar. I wanted a wife to help me build the life I'd already planned. But maybe what I really needed was to learn so I could build a different life entirely. The conversation continued past sunset, ranging from practical matters, their work, their housing, their plans for the coming weeks, to more philosophical questions about risk, independence, and the unexpected directions life could take. Charlotte found herself relaxing in Samuel's company, appreciating his thoughtfulness and the way he listened without trying to solve problems that weren't his. To solve that, when he finally left, Charlotte returned to her letter with a clearer sense of what she wanted to say. She wasn't writing to explain a disaster, but to describe an adventure uncertain in outcome, but rich with possibility. Outside her windows, Cedar Falls settled into its evening quiet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new opportunities to prove herself in this frontier community. But tonight, in her small apartment above the general store, Charlotte Winters felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction of a day well lived and the excited anticipation of days to come. The schoolhouse stood at the northern edge of Cedar Falls, a modest white building with tall windows and a bell tower that commanded views of both the town and the surrounding wilderness. Charlotte approached it on a crisp morning 3 days after her arrival, carrying a notebook and the key Mayor Patterson had provided for her inspection visit. The interior revealed a single large room with wooden desks arranged in neat rows, a teacher's desk at the front, and a blackboard that had seen better days. Bookshelves lined one wall, though they held only a sparse collection of primers and basic texts. Everything was clean but showed signs of disused dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight, the faint mustiness of a space that had been closed too long. Charlotte moved through the room systematically, opening windows to let in fresh air and examining the educational materials available. The previous teacher had left behind lesson plans and attendance records that told the story of Cedar Falls' educational challenges. Enrollment fluctuated wildly based on seasonal work demands, with children disappearing for weeks during harvest time or when families moved to follow mining opportunities. Age ranges within the classroom varied dramatically, 8-year-olds learning their letters, alongside 15-year-olds who'd never had formal schooling. She was absorbed in studying these records when footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. A woman in her 30s entered, leading 2 children by the hand, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent Charlotte couldn't immediately place. "I am Maria Santos. My children, they need school. I heard maybe a new teacher comes." Charlotte introduced herself, learning that Maria was married to one of the Mexican vaqueros who worked for the largest cattle ranch in the area. Her children, Carlos and Isabella, had received some education in their previous home, but none since. Arriving in Cedar Falls 6 months earlier. "Carlos reads a little English," Maria explained, "but Isabella, she knows only Spanish words. They are good children, want to learn, but the last teacher—" She made a helpless gesture. She said it was too difficult, too many languages, too many ages altogether. Charlotte knelt to the children's eye level, greeting them in the few Spanish phrases she remembered from a Mexican family who'd lived in her Boston neighborhood. Isabella's face brightened at the familiar sounds, while Carlos watched with the guarded expression of a child who'd learned to expect disappointment. "When school begins again," Charlotte told Maria, "Carlos and Isabella will be welcome. Learning happens differently for everyone, but that doesn't make it impossible." After the Santos family left, Charlotte remained in the schoolhouse, her mind racing with possibilities. Traditional educational methods clearly hadn't worked for Cedar Falls' diverse student population. But what if she approached teaching more like Lily approached business, recognizing that each child brought different strengths and needs, then finding ways to build on those differences rather than fight them? She began making notes, sketching out ideas for mixed-age learning groups, hands-on projects that could engage children with varying literacy levels, and ways to incorporate the practical skills frontier children needed alongside academic subjects. By the time she locked the schoolhouse and headed back to town, she had the beginnings of an educational philosophy that excited her more than any teaching opportunity she'd considered in Boston. Her route back to the general store took her past the construction site where a new building was taking shape. Samuel stood on a ladder, hammering roof beams into place while the building's owner, a man Charlotte recognized as the town's barber, directed the work from below. "Foundation solid," Samuel was saying as Charlotte approached. "These timbers should see you through 20 winters without trouble, assuming you maintain the roof properly." The barber, a thin man named Henderson, nodded appreciatively. "My previous shop leaked every time it rained. Customers don't appreciate getting a haircut while dodging drips." Samuel noticed Charlotte and climbed down from the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "How was your schoolhouse inspection?" "Inspiring," Charlotte replied, meaning it. "Challenging but inspiring. It looks like you're staying busy as well. More work than I can handle alone, actually. Word's gotten around that I'm reliable, and everyone seems to have projects they've been putting off." He gestured toward the partially completed building. "Mr. Henderson here wants to expand his barber shop to include a small general store section. Says the town's growing fast enough to support specialized businesses." Henderson overheard and joined the conversation. "That's exactly right, Miss Winters. 5 years ago, Cedar Falls was barely a settlement. Now we've got enough people to need a real barber, a dedicated general store, maybe even separate businesses. For hardware and clothing, growth brings opportunities." Charlotte found Henderson's optimism infectious. In Boston, growth had meant increased competition for limited opportunities. Here, it seemed to mean expanded possibilities for everyone willing to work for them. "Speaking of opportunities," Henderson continued, "I heard you might be taking over the school. My nephew Tommy's been running wild since the last teacher left. Boy needs education, but he's got too much energy for sitting still all day." "What kinds of things interest Tommy?" "Building things, taking them apart, figuring out how they work. Last week I caught him dismantling my pocket watch to see what made it tick. Nearly gave me apoplexy, but he managed to put it back together. Better than before." Charlotte made a mental note about Tommy Henderson. Children with mechanical aptitudes often struggled in traditional classrooms, but they could thrive when given hands-on learning opportunities. "If I become the teacher, I'll make sure Tommy's interests are accommodated," she promised. Back at the general store, Charlotte found Lily dealing with an unusual situation. A well-dressed woman in traveling clothes stood at the counter, arguing in clipped Eastern tones about the quality of available accommodations. "I specifically requested a room with private bathing facilities," the woman was saying. "The hotel clerk informed me that such amenities are not available. Surely there must be alternative arrangements for travelers of refinement." Lily's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but Charlotte could see the effort it required. "Ma'am, Cedar Falls is a frontier town. We provide clean, comfortable lodging, but luxury accommodations aren't available. Nearest hotel with private bathing would be Helena, 50 miles south." The traveler woman, of perhaps 40, with elaborate clothes and an air of entitlement, looked around the store with visible dismay. "This is most unsatisfactory. I was assured that Western towns were becoming quite civilized." Charlotte stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to help while learning something about the customer service challenges Lily faced. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I'm Charlotte Winters, Mrs. Chun's new assistant. Perhaps I can help address your concerns. Are you visiting Cedar Falls for business or pleasure? The woman's expression shifted slightly at Charlotte's refined accent and respectful tone. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth. I'm traveling to investigate mining investments on behalf of my late husband's business partners. I expected to find, well, more sophisticated facilities. Charlotte understood immediately. Mrs. Ashworth wasn't just another demanding customer. She was a potential investor whose impressions of Cedar Falls could affect the town's economic future. Poor treatment might result in negative reports that could discourage other investment. I can certainly understand your expectations, Mrs. Ashworth. Cedar Falls is indeed growing rapidly, and accommodations are expanding to meet demand. While we may not yet offer urban luxury, I think you'll find our hospitality quite genuine. Mrs. Kowalski at the Silver Dollar takes great pride in providing comfortable, clean rooms, and her dining room serves excellent meals prepared from local ingredients. Charlotte paused, then continued with a slight smile. And if you're investigating mining investments, you'll want to speak with authentic frontier people, anyway, the miners, ranchers, and business owners who understand local conditions. Their insights will be far more valuable than anything you'd learn in a fancy hotel. Mrs. Ashworth's expression is thoughtful. You make a reasonable point, Miss Winters. Perhaps I was approaching this incorrectly. Mrs. Chun, Charlotte continued. Doesn't Mrs. Ashworth's investigation sound like something Mayor Patterson would want to know about? I'm sure he'd be delighted to arrange introductions to the mining company representatives and local business owners. Lily caught on immediately. Absolutely. Mayor Patterson loves showing off our town's potential to investors. I could send word that you're here, Mrs. Ashworth. I'm sure he'd make time to meet with you this afternoon. Mrs. Ashworth's demeanor shifted from complaint to interest. That would be most helpful. And Miss Winters, you mentioned local ingredients. Are there particular specialties I should try? Mrs. Kowalski makes excellent trout with herbs she grows herself, and the beef here is remarkable cattle raised on mountain grassland. Very different from what you'd find in eastern cities. By the time Mrs. Ashworth left for the hotel, she seemed genuinely interested in experiencing Cedar Falls rather than criticizing it. Lily watched her go with an expression of impressed approval. Nicely handled, she said to Charlotte. You turned a potential problem into a potential asset. I recognize the type. In Boston, I dealt with plenty of people who complained about things being different from what they expected. Usually they just needed to feel important and understood. Important lesson for frontier business. Not all customers are locals who understand limitations. Some are outsiders with money and influence. How you treat them affects more than immediate sales. The afternoon brought the weekly cattle drive through town, a dozen riders herding perhaps 200 head of cattle toward the railhead 30 miles east. The event temporarily transformed Cedar Falls into something from a Western novel, with cowboys and dust-covered chaps calling out to friends, cattle lowing and milling in the street, and the controlled chaos of moving large animals through a settled area. Charlotte watched from the store's front window as Samuel emerged from Henderson's barbershop to help direct cattle away from the construction site. His movements were confident and natural around the animals, suggesting experience with ranch work that went beyond building and repair. Samuel knows cattle, Lily observed, joining Charlotte at the window. He owned a ranch before the mining company claimed it, I remember. But knowing cattle is different from owning them. He handles those animals like someone who grew up around livestock, not someone who bought his first cow as an adult. Charlotte stored this observation, another piece of information about Samuel's background that didn't quite fit with the story he'd told in his letters. Not deception necessarily, but perhaps simplification of a more complex history. The cattle drive passed through town in less than an hour, leaving behind dust, fresh manure, and the satisfied buzz of a community that had briefly connected with the larger rhythms of frontier commerce. Several cowboys stopped at the general store for supplies, their presence bringing energy and news from other settlements along their route. "Mining's picking up around Butte," one told Lily as he purchased tobacco and coffee. "New claims opening every week, and the railroad's talking about extending service. Could mean more freight traffic through Cedar Falls. Railroad extension would change everything," Lily mused after the cowboys departed. "Faster shipping, more reliable supply lines, easier travel for people like Mrs. Ashworth. Good for business, but it would also mean faster changes, more competition." Charlotte was beginning to understand that frontier communities lived in constant tension between growth and stability. Too little growth meant stagnation and eventual abandonment. Too much brought opportunities, but also disruption of the personal. Relationships and mutual dependence that made small-town life work. Late in the afternoon, Mayor Patterson arrived with news about Charlotte's teaching interview. "School board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow evening," he announced. 3 members plus myself, practical people who care more about results than credentials. They'll want to know how you plan to handle our particular challenges." "What are their main concerns?" "Attendance, primarily. Previous teachers expected regular schedules, consistent presence. Doesn't work when families move children in and out of school based on work demands. Also, discipline problems. Some of our students are older, stronger, and more independent than teachers from the back east expect." Charlotte thought about Tommy Henderson dismantling pocket watches, Carlos Santos guarding against disappointment, and Isabella Santos brightening at Spanish words. Each child would require different approaches, different motivation. "I'd like to meet some of the parents before the interview," she said. "Understanding what families need from education will help me explain how I can provide it." Mayor Patterson looked pleased. "Excellent approach. I'll arrange introductions. Parents appreciate being consulted rather than simply informed about educational decisions." As evening approached, Charlotte helped Lily close the store, her mind already working through questions she wanted to ask parents about their children's educational needs and learning styles. The teaching opportunity felt increasingly real and increasingly exciting. Samuel appeared as they finished securing the building, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of metal tools. "Productive day?" Charlotte asked. "Very. Finished Henderson's roof, started foundation work for a new stable, and got commissioned to build custom shelving for the hotel's expanded dining room. At this rate, I'll have steady work through winter." They walked together toward their respective lodgings, the easy companionship that had developed between them making the evening stroll pleasant despite the day's fatigue. "Charlotte," Samuel said as they reached the general store, "can I ask you something that might be overstepping?" "Of course." "Are you happy? I mean, genuinely happy with how things have worked out? Not just making the best of a bad situation, but actually glad to be here doing this?" The question surprised her with its directness and its importance. Samuel was asking whether she considered their changed circumstances a success or simply an acceptable alternative to disaster. Charlotte looked around at the town settling into evening lights appearing in windows, the sound of families gathering for supper, the sense of a community that was building something together rather than simply enduring circumstances. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm genuinely happy. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm building something that's entirely mine. Not preserving what someone else created, not fulfilling expectations others set for me, but creating a life based on my own choices and abilities." Samuel's expression showed relief mixed with something that might have been pride. "I feel the same way. It's strange we both lost what we thought we wanted, but we found something better in the process. Maybe we needed to lose those things to discover what we actually wanted. Maybe we did." As Charlotte climbed the stairs to her apartment, she realized that tomorrow's school board interview no longer felt like a test she might fail, but like an opportunity to share ideas she was excited to implement. The transformation from desperate mail-order bride to confident frontier teacher had happened, so gradually she barely noticed it occurring. Standing at her kitchen window, she could see Samuel walking toward his boarding house, his stride confident despite the day's physical labor. Below her, Lily moved through the store's interior, checking locks and extinguishing lamps with the methodical care of someone who took pride in her responsibilities. For the first time since leaving Boston, Charlotte felt not just hope about the future, but genuine contentment with the present. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, new chances to build the life she was creating one decision at a time. But tonight, in her small apartment above the general store in a frontier town she'd never heard of 6 months ago, Charlotte Winters was exactly where she belonged. The morning of Charlotte's school board interview dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds pressing down from the mountains and the smell of approaching rain in the air. She woke early, her stomach tight with nerves despite her growing confidence in her educational ideas. Lily noticed her anxiety immediately when Charlotte arrived downstairs to help open the store. "Interview nerves?" Lily asked, arranging bolts of fabric with practiced efficiency. "Some. I've never interviewed for a teaching position before. Only assisted at schools where I was already known. This feels like starting completely fresh." "Good thing then. Fresh start means no preconceptions, no old expectations to live up to or down to. You get judged purely on what you bring to the table." The morning brought an unexpected visitor, Dr. James Morrison, the traveling physician who served Cedar Falls and several surrounding settlements. He was a man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and the calm competence of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions with limited resources. "Mrs. Chun," he said, removing his hat as he entered the store, "I heard there's a new teacher candidate in town. I wanted to meet her before the school board makes their decision." Lily introduced Charlotte, explaining Dr. Morrison's role in the community. As the only medical professional within 50 miles, his opinions carried considerable weight with local families. "Miss Winters," Dr. Morrison said, studying her with professional assessment, "I understand you're from Boston. What brings you to frontier education?" Charlotte had prepared for this type of question, but Dr. Morrison's direct manner made casual responses seem inadequate. "I believe education should serve the communities where it's provided. Dr. Morrison, in Boston, I saw too many schools that prepared children for lives their families couldn't afford to give them, while ignoring the practical skills they actually needed. Here, I see an opportunity to create education that's both academically sound and genuinely useful." Interesting perspective. "Can you give me a specific example?" Charlotte thought of her conversations with various parents over the past few days. Tommy Henderson has mechanical aptitudes that traditional classrooms ignore or even punish. But if I can teach him to read through instruction manuals and practice mathematics through building projects, he'll develop academic skills while strengthening his natural talents. Both serve him better than forcing him to memorize poetry. He'll never use. Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. "That shows practical thinking. What about medical education?" "Frontier children need to understand basic health and safety concepts that urban children can take for granted. I'd very much like to include practical health education. Understanding how to treat common injuries, recognize signs of serious illness, maintain sanitation. These seem like essential life skills for any frontier community." "They are. Previous teachers considered such topics too crude for proper education. Would you be willing to coordinate with me on developing an appropriate curriculum?" Charlotte felt excitement building. Collaboration with Dr. Morrison would add credibility to her candidacy while providing expertise she lacked. "I would welcome that collaboration. Medical knowledge combined with educational method could create something very valuable for local families." After Dr. Morrison left, Lily looked thoughtful. That was well handled. Dr. Morrison's recommendation carries significant weight with parents. If he supports your candidacy, the school board will pay attention. The afternoon brought unexpected drama when Mrs. Ashworth returned to the store in considerable agitation, accompanied by a rough-looking man Charlotte didn't recognize. "Mrs. Chun," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I need to speak with you about a serious matter. This is Mr. Jake Brennan, foreman at the Broken Arrow Mining Company." Charlotte felt her stomach drop. Broken Arrow was the company that had claimed Samuel's ranch, destroying his original plans and forcing their current arrangement. Brennan was a large man with hard eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. He looked around the store with the calculating gaze of someone assessing value and vulnerability. "Mrs. Chun," Brennan said, his voice carrying a slight threat, "I understand you've been speaking with Mrs. Ashworth about local investment opportunities. I wanted to make sure she gets accurate information about our operations." Lily's expression remained neutral, but Charlotte could see tension in the set of her shoulders. "I've answered Mrs. Ashworth's questions about local businesses and facilities. Nothing more." "See, that's the problem," Brennan continued. "Some folks in town have been spreading stories about Broken Arrow's business practices. Unfair stories that might give investors the wrong impression about our company's reputation." Mrs. Ashworth looked uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Brennan, I'm perfectly capable of evaluating information I receive. I don't require protection from local opinions." "Of course not, ma'am. But you should know that some people here have personal grudges against our company. Might color their judgment when discussing business matters." Charlotte realized Brennan was threatening anyone who might speak negatively about Broken Arrow. To Mrs. Ashworth, effectively trying to control the information an important investor would receive. The implications went far beyond the immediate conversation. "Mr. Brennan," Charlotte said carefully, "surely a reputable company like Broken Arrow would welcome honest evaluation from potential investors. Transparency usually indicates strength, doesn't it?" Brennan's attention shifted to Charlotte, his eyes narrowing as he assessed this unexpected challenge to his intimidation tactics. "And you are?" "Charlotte Winters. I work here at the store." "Ah, you're the Eastern lady I heard about. Samuel Harrison's intended bride, before his ranch got claimed for outstanding debts. Must be disappointing when promises don't work out as expected." The words were delivered with casual cruelty, designed to embarrass Charlotte while reinforcing Brennan's power to destroy people's plans. But instead of embarrassment, Charlotte felt anger rising not just for herself, but for Samuel, and anyone else this man had bullied. "Actually, Mr. Brennan, I've found that adaptability serves better than rigid expectations. People who can adjust to changing circumstances often discover opportunities they never would have found otherwise." Mrs. Ashworth was watching this exchange with growing interest, clearly recognizing the underlying tensions, but uncertain of their significance. "Adaptability," Brennan repeated, his tone mocking. "Fancy word for making the best of a bad situation. Though I suppose Eastern ladies learn to put pretty words on ugly realities." Lily stepped forward before Charlotte could respond, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Mr. Brennan, this is a place of business, not a forum for personal discussions. If you have legitimate business with Mrs. Ashworth, please conduct it. Otherwise, I'll ask you to leave." Brennan looked surprised by Lily's directness, as if he expected his presence alone to cow the shopkeeper into compliance. After a moment of tense silence, he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Chun, just wanted to make sure Mrs. Ashworth understands the full situation before making investment decisions. Good day, ladies." After Brennan left, Mrs. Ashworth remained in the store, her expression thoughtful and troubled. "That was most enlightening," she said finally. "Mr. Brennan seems quite concerned about controlling information flow. In my experience, legitimate businesses don't require such Protective measures. Charlotte and Lily exchanged glances, recognizing an opportunity to provide Mrs. Ashworth with perspective that Brennan clearly didn't want her to have. Mrs. Ashworth, Lily said carefully, small towns often have complex business relationships. Broken Arrow is a powerful company with significant influence in this area, and significant willingness to use that influence, apparently. Mrs. Ashworth moved to the window, looking out at the street where Brennan was talking animatedly with two other rough-looking men. Miss Winters, you mentioned Mr. Harrison's ranch being claimed for outstanding debts. Was this a recent occurrence? Charlotte hesitated, uncertain how much detail was appropriate. But Mrs. Ashworth's investment decisions could affect the entire community, and she deserved accurate information. Very recent. Mr. Harrison believed he'd purchased clear title to his land, but Broken Arrow produced debt papers from the previous owner that Mr. Harrison knew nothing about. Legal challenges would take years and cost more than he could afford. Interesting, and not uncommon in rapidly developing areas where land records are incomplete and legal oversight is minimal. Mrs. Ashworth's tone suggested familiarity with such tactics. Thank you for the information. It will certainly factor into my evaluation. Late in the afternoon, Mayor Patterson arrived to escort Charlotte to the school board meeting, which was being held in the back room of Henderson's barbershop. The setting was informal, but the atmosphere was serious as Charlotte faced three local parents whose children's education would depend on her competence. Besides Mayor Patterson, the board consisted of Mrs. Rodriguez, wife of the blacksmith who traded horseshoeing for store credit, Mr. Jensen, a rancher whose family lived 15 miles outside town, and Mrs. Sullivan, a widow who ran the town's small restaurant. All three studied Charlotte with the careful attention of people making a decision that would affect their families directly. Miss Winters, Mayor Patterson began, we appreciate your interest in our teaching position. As I mentioned, we have particular challenges that require flexible approaches. Charlotte had prepared extensively for this moment, organizing her thoughts around the specific needs she'd observed in Cedar Falls rather than abstract educational theories. I understand your primary concerns involve irregular attendance and diverse student backgrounds, she said. Rather than fighting these realities, I'd like to work with them. Flexible scheduling could accommodate families whose children help with seasonal work. Mixed-age learning groups could pair advanced students with beginners for mutual benefit. Practical projects could engage different learning styles while teaching core academic skills. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward with interest. Can you give us a specific example? Building projects, for instance. Students could learn mathematics through measuring and calculating materials, develop reading skills through instruction manuals, practice writing through project documentation, and study science through understanding how tools and structures work. Academic learning happens naturally when it's connected to hands-on activities. Mr. Jensen nodded approvingly. My boy learns better when he's doing something with his hands. Previous teacher just had him copying letters over and over. Letters and numbers are important, but they're tools for communication and problem solving, not ends in themselves. If children understand why they need these skills, they'll be more motivated to develop them. Mrs. Sullivan had been quiet, but now she spoke up. What about discipline? Some of our older students have been challenging for previous teachers. Charlotte had anticipated this concern. Discipline problems often arise when students are bored or feel their time is being wasted. Engaging them in meaningful activities usually prevents most behavioral issues. For serious problems, I believe in addressing causes rather than just symptoms. And if engagement doesn't work, Mayor Patterson asked, then I'll work with parents to understand what's happening in the child's life that might be affecting their behavior. Sometimes discipline problems reflect problems at home, health issues, or simply mismatch between the child's needs and the educational approach being used. The board members exchanged glances, and Charlotte could see approval in their expressions. These were practical people who wanted solutions rather than theories. "Miss Winters," Mrs. Rodriguez said, "you mentioned working with Dr. Morrison on health education. Can you elaborate?" Charlotte described her conversation with the doctor, explaining how basic medical knowledge could be integrated into regular curriculum. The board members' interest was obvious. This was exactly the kind of practical education their children needed. "One more question," Mr. Jensen said. "How long do you plan to stay? We've had teachers leave after one difficult winter, leaving our children's education disrupted." The question went to the heart of Charlotte's commitment to Cedar Falls and her new life. 6 months ago, she would have qualified any long-term promises, maintaining escape routes in case circumstances changed. Now she found her answer came without hesitation. "Mr. Jensen, I came here planning to build a new life, not just fill time until something better came along. I've found opportunities and community connections that I value highly. Cedar Falls feels like home now, and I want to contribute to its future rather than just pass through." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and she could see it affecting the board members' assessment of her candidacy. After 45 minutes of questions covering everything from curriculum details to disciplinary philosophy, Mayor Patterson called for private deliberation. Charlotte waited outside while the board discussed her application, watching through the barbershop window as Samuel worked late on a construction project across the street. He noticed her and approached, his clothes dusty from the day's labor, but his expression alert and concerned. "How did it go?" "I think well, but it's hard to tell. They asked good questions and seemed interested in my ideas, but..." Charlotte shrugged, feeling suddenly drained from the intensity of presenting herself for judgment. "But you won't know until they decide. I understand the feeling. Every new job contract feels like a test of whether people believe you can deliver what you promise." They stood together in the evening air, which had grown cooler as the threatening clouds finally began releasing their first drops of rain. The town was settling into its nightly routines, but the barbershop remained lit as the school board continued their deliberations. "Samuel," Charlotte said impulsively, "are you happy with how things worked out? Really happy, not just making the best of it?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "You know what surprises me most? I'm not just happy with how things worked out, I'm grateful they worked out this way. If everything had gone according to plan, I would have been satisfied, probably content. But I never would have discovered what I was actually capable of when everything fell apart." "You mean the construction work?" "That, but also this." He gestured around them, encompassing the town, their situation, the unexpected directions their lives had taken. "Learning that I could lose everything I thought I wanted and still build something valuable. Learning that starting over doesn't have to mean settling for less." The barbershop door opened, interrupting their conversation. Mayor Patterson emerged, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Miss Winters," he said formally, "the Cedar Falls School Board would like to offer you the position of town teacher beginning Monday next. Terms include housing in the teacher's residence behind the schoolhouse, salary of $35 monthly paid quarterly, and authority to develop curriculum appropriate to local needs. Do you accept?" Charlotte felt a surge of triumph so strong it left her momentarily speechless. She had done it, earned a position based entirely on her own merits, in a community that was becoming genuinely important to her. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I accept with pleasure." As rain began falling in earnest, the three of them stood outside the barbershop discussing practical details of Charlotte's new position. But Charlotte's mind was already racing ahead to Monday morning, to her first day as a real teacher in a real school, building the future she had never dared imagine when she stepped off that train just 1 week ago. Charlotte's first week as Cedar Falls schoolteacher passed in a whirlwind of preparation and discovery. The teacher's residence behind the schoolhouse proved to be a small but comfortable cottage with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over the mountains. Moving her belongings from the apartment above the general store felt symbolic, another step away from her original plans and deeper into the life she was actively creating. On Monday morning, 13 children arrived at the schoolhouse, ranging in age from 6-year-old Isabella Santos to 16-year-old Jake Morrison, Dr. Morrison's nephew who had been working at his uncle's practice, but whose parents insisted he needed formal education before choosing his life's work. The diversity Charlotte had anticipated was even more complex in reality. Children from ranch families who rode miles to attend school, miners' children who had moved frequently and received sporadic education, and immigrants' children who were learning English alongside academic subjects. Her first innovation was abandoning traditional grade-level groupings in favor of skill-based learning clusters. Isabella Santos and 7-year-old Emma Jensen both needed basic reading instruction, despite their age difference, while 12-year-old Carlos Santos and 14-year-old Tommy Henderson could tackle advanced mathematics problems together. The arrangement confused some children initially, but within days they began helping each other in ways that transcended artificial age barriers. "Miss Winters," Tommy Henderson said on Wednesday afternoon, looking up from a geometry problem he was solving using wooden blocks. "This is the same kind of thinking I use when I'm figuring out how to fix something that's broken." "Exactly right, Tommy. Mathematics isn't separate from practical work. It's the foundation that makes practical work possible." The breakthrough moment came on Friday when Charlotte introduced her first integrated project. Each learning cluster would design and build a scale model of a frontier building, a house, a store, a barn, using mathematical calculations for proportions, writing skills for planning documents, reading skills for researching construction, methods and scientific principles for understanding structural stability. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Children who had fidgeted through traditional lessons became absorbed in measuring, calculating, and problem-solving. Jake Morrison suggested they visit actual construction sites to observe professional techniques, leading to Charlotte's realization that the entire town could serve as an extended classroom. This innovation brought an unexpected visitor on Friday afternoon. Samuel appeared at the schoolhouse during the final hour, carrying his toolbox and wearing the slightly formal expression of someone conducting official business. "Miss Winters," he said, removing his hat as he entered the classroom, "Mayor Patterson asked me to speak with you about a proposal." The children looked up from their projects with curiosity, recognizing Samuel from his various construction jobs around town. Charlotte felt a flutter of uncertainty. Official proposals from the mayor could mean anything from additional responsibilities to complaints about her teaching methods. "What kind of proposal?" "The town council has been discussing ways to provide practical education for older students who will soon be entering the workforce. They wondered if you might be interested in establishing an apprenticeship program that combines academic learning with hands-on training in various trades." Charlotte's pulse quickened with excitement. This was exactly the kind of educational innovation she had hoped to develop, but she hadn't expected official support so quickly. What would such a program involve? Samuel glanced around the classroom, noting the building models and the children's obvious engagement with their projects. Students would spend part of their time in traditional classroom subjects and part working alongside skilled craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, store managers, even Dr. Morrison for those interested in medical work. They'd learn trades while continuing their academic education. Tommy Henderson's hand shot up immediately. "Could I work with you on construction projects?" Samuel smiled. "That's exactly the kind of arrangement we're considering. Tommy, you'd learn mathematics through real building projects, develop reading skills through technical manuals, and gain practical experience that could lead to your own business someday." Charlotte could see the possibilities multiplying rapidly. How many local businesses would be willing to participate? Most of them, actually. Mrs. Chun mentioned she'd enjoy teaching business principles through store management. Henderson at the barber shop said he'd welcome help with his expansion project. Even Mrs. Kowalski at the hotel expressed interest in teaching hospitality and cooking skills. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with children offering suggestions and Samuel explaining details of how such a program might work. By the time he left, Charlotte's mind was racing with plans for curriculum that would serve students' immediate needs while preparing them for adult responsibilities. That evening, she sat in her cottage grading assignments and developing ideas for the apprenticeship program. A knock at her door interrupted her work. Lily Chun stood on her doorstep holding a covered basket that smelled like fresh bread. "Brought you supper," Lily explained, entering when Charlotte invited her in. "Figured you might be too busy planning lessons to cook properly." The basket contained not just bread, but soup, cheese, and fruit preserves, a complete meal prepared with obvious care. Charlotte felt touched by the thoughtfulness, but also curious about Lily's motivations for the visit. "This is wonderfully kind, Lily, thank you. Also wanted to talk with you about something important." Lily's expression grew serious as they sat at Charlotte's small table. "Heard about the apprenticeship program proposal. Good idea, but you should know it might create complications." "What kind of complications?" "Broken Arrow Mining Company has been recruiting young men for mining work promises of good wages, quick money, no education required. Apprenticeship program that keeps boys in school longer might interfere with their recruitment efforts." Charlotte hadn't considered this angle, but it made immediate sense. Mining companies benefited from workers who had limited options and little education to question dangerous conditions or unfair treatment. "Do you think Brennan will oppose the program?" "Almost certainly. Question is how far he'll go to stop it." Lily's voice carried concern based on experience. "Broken Arrow has significant influence in this territory. They can pressure suppliers, influence government contracts, make life difficult for businesses that cross them." "Are you suggesting I shouldn't pursue the program?" "Not at all. Suggesting you understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about education anymore. It's about community independence versus corporate control." The implications were sobering. Charlotte had come to Cedar Falls seeking personal independence, but apparently she was now positioned at the center of a larger struggle for community self-determination. What do other business owners think? Most support the idea privately, but they're nervous about opposing Broken Arrow openly. Economic pressure can destroy small businesses quickly, and everyone has families to feed. Charlotte thought about the children in her classroom: Tommy Henderson with his mechanical aptitude, Carlos Santos eager to learn English, Jake Morrison torn between medical interests and family expectations. Each represented potential that could be developed or wasted depending on the educational opportunities available to them. "Lily, if this program could genuinely help local children build better futures, isn't it worth some risk?" "Depends on your definition of acceptable risk, but yes, I think it is. Question is whether we can build enough community support to withstand pressure from Broken Arrow." They spent the evening discussing strategies for garnering support while minimizing economic vulnerability. Lily's business experience proved invaluable as they considered ways to present the apprenticeship program as serving community needs rather than challenging corporate interests. Saturday morning brought an unexpected test of Charlotte's growing confidence. Mrs. Ashworth appeared at the schoolhouse, accompanied by two men in business suits who introduced themselves as representatives of the Territorial Education Commission. "Miss Winters," Mrs. Ashworth said, "these gentlemen are evaluating educational facilities for potential territorial funding. I suggested they visit Cedar Falls to observe your innovative teaching methods." Charlotte felt a moment of panic. Her classroom innovations were still experimental, her teaching methods untested by any official standards. Being evaluated by territorial representatives felt premature and potentially disastrous. The older of the two men, Commissioner Bradley, had the bearing of someone accustomed to inspecting institutions and finding them lacking. His younger companion, Mr. Davies, carried a notebook and seemed more interested in observing than judging. "Miss Winters," Commissioner Bradley began, "we understand you've implemented some unconventional approaches to frontier education. We're here to assess whether such methods meet territorial standards for academic rigor." Charlotte straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of confidence she was still discovering she possessed. "Commissioner Bradley, I'd be happy to demonstrate our methods and discuss the reasoning behind them. Would you prefer to observe a regular class session or see examples of student work?" "Both, if possible. We're particularly interested in how you maintain educational standards while accommodating the irregular attendance patterns common in frontier communities." Charlotte led them through the schoolhouse, explaining her flexible grouping system and showing examples of student projects that demonstrated academic learning through practical applications. The building models had evolved into sophisticated constructions that required advanced mathematical calculations, detailed written specifications, and research into historical building techniques. "This is Jake Morrison's design for a frontier medical clinic," Charlotte explained, showing them a carefully constructed model complete with detailed floor plans. The project required him to research medical facility requirements, calculate square footage and materials needed, write specifications for construction, and present his design to the class with supporting arguments for his choices. Commissioner Bradley examined the model skeptically. "Where are the traditional academic assignments? Composition papers, mathematical exercises, reading comprehension tests?" Integrated throughout the project work. Jake's written specifications demonstrate composition skills, his calculations show mathematical competency, and his research required extensive reading and comprehension of technical materials. Mr. Davies looked up from his notebook. "This is fascinating, Miss Winters. How do you assess individual student progress without standardized testing?" Charlotte had anticipated this question. "I assess students continuously through project work, individual conferences, and practical demonstrations of skills. For example, I know Tommy Henderson has mastered fractions because he uses them accurately in construction calculations. I know Isabella Santos is developing reading skills because she can follow written instructions for her projects." The evaluation continued for 2 hours, with Commissioner Bradley raising increasingly detailed questions about curriculum standards and Mr. Davies showing growing enthusiasm for Charlotte's innovative approaches. Mrs. Ashworth observed quietly, occasionally asking questions that suggested she understood the broader implications of what she was witnessing. "Miss Winters," Commissioner Bradley said finally, "your methods are certainly creative. However, territorial education standards require specific curriculum benchmarks that I'm not certain your approach addresses adequately." Charlotte felt defensive anger rising but forced herself to respond professionally. "Commissioner, what specific benchmarks concern you?" "I believe our students are meeting or exceeding standard requirements, but through methods that make learning relevant to their actual lives. Reading comprehension, for instance. How do you ensure students can analyze literary texts without formal literature classes?" Jake Morrison analyzed historical accounts of frontier medical practices for his clinic project. Carlos Santos researched and compared different architectural styles for his building design. Isabella Santos read and summarized folktales from 3 different cultures as part of a cultural exchange project. All demonstrated analytical reading skills, but applied to materials they found personally meaningful. Mr. Davies looked impressed. "Commissioner, this approach seems to develop critical thinking skills more effectively than rote memorization of predetermined texts." Commissioner Bradley remained skeptical, but Mrs. Ashworth unexpectedly entered the conversation. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom discussions, "I've observed educational institutions throughout the eastern states, and I can tell you that Miss Winters' students demonstrate engagement and practical competency that I rarely see in traditional classrooms. Perhaps the question isn't whether her methods meet current standards, but whether current standards serve frontier communities effectively." The observation shifted the entire dynamic of the evaluation. Instead of defending her methods against established criteria, Charlotte found herself participating in a broader discussion about educational goals and community needs. "Mrs. Ashworth raises an important point," Mr. Davies said. "Territorial education must serve territorial realities. Miss Winters' approach seems well adapted to frontier conditions while maintaining academic rigor." Commissioner Bradley remained unconvinced, but he agreed to include detailed observations in his report rather than making immediate judgments about compliance with territorial standards. After the evaluation team left, Charlotte felt emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. Mrs. Ashworth lingered, apparently wanting to discuss the morning's events. "Miss Winters," she said, "I want you to know that I was genuinely impressed by what I observed here. Your students are learning skills they'll actually use while developing intellectual capabilities that will serve them throughout their lives. Thank you, Mrs. Ashworth. Your support during the evaluation was invaluable. I had ulterior motives, I'm afraid. My investment investigation has convinced me that communities with strong educational foundations offer better long-term opportunities than those dependent solely on extractive industries like mining." Charlotte understood immediately. Mrs. Ashworth was positioning herself to invest in Cedar Falls' future rather than simply extracting profits from its natural resources. "Does that mean you're considering local investments?" "Several, actually, including potential funding for educational innovations like your apprenticeship program." Mrs. Ashworth's expression grew serious. "However, I should warn you that Broken Arrow Mining has been pressuring me to focus my investments on ventures that support their operations rather than compete with them." "What kind of pressure?" "Veiled threats about the difficulties of operating successful businesses in territories where mining companies control transportation and supply lines. Nothing directly threatening, but clear implications that opposing their interests could prove expensive." Charlotte felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly the kind of intimidation Lily had warned her about, and it was already affecting potential supporters of community development. "Mrs. Ashworth, are you concerned about proceeding with your investment plans?" "My dear, I've been dealing with corporate intimidation since before you were born. The question isn't whether I'm concerned, but whether this community has the backbone to support positive change when it becomes difficult." As Mrs. Ashworth left, Charlotte realized that her educational innovations had indeed become part of a larger struggle for community independence. The apprenticeship program wasn't just about teaching methods. It was about whether Cedar Falls would develop its own local talent and economic independence, or remain dependent on outside corporations that offered quick profits but no lasting prosperity. Standing in her schoolhouse as afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountains, Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had come to Cedar Falls, seeking personal independence, and had found herself positioned as a leader in the community's quest for self-determination. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she had been powerless to control even her own circumstances. Now, her decisions could affect the future of an entire community. The transformation felt both thrilling and terrifying. But one thing was certain: she was no longer the desperate woman who had fled her wedding to a stranger. She was Charlotte Winters, teacher and community builder, ready to fight for the future she was helping to create. Part 7. Final. 3 weeks after the territorial evaluation, Charlotte woke to the sound of urgent knocking at her cottage door. Dawn was barely breaking over the mountains, and frost covered the windows with delicate patterns that spoke of winter's approach. She opened the door to find Samuel standing on her doorstep, his expression grim and his clothes suggesting he'd been up all night. "Charlotte, there's trouble. Big trouble." She invited him in, quickly stoking the fire and putting coffee on to brew while he explained the crisis that had erupted overnight. Broken Arrow filed legal challenges against half the businesses in town, Samuel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. They're claiming various contract violations, permit irregularities, disputed land claims, anything they can use to tie people up in court and drain their resources. Charlotte felt her stomach drop. Which businesses? Lily's store, Henderson's barbershop expansion, the hotel, even Dr. Morrison's practice. They're going after anyone who's publicly supported the apprenticeship program or spoken favorably to Mrs. Ashworth about community development. The systematic nature of the attack was clear. Broken Arrow was using legal warfare to eliminate opposition to their control over the territory's economic development. Small business owners couldn't afford prolonged legal battles, regardless of the merits of their cases. What about Mrs. Ashworth's investments? That's the interesting part. Broken Arrow offered her a partnership deal yesterday, exclusive access to mining-related opportunities in exchange for withdrawing support from community development projects. They gave her 24 hours to decide. Charlotte understood. Immediately, Mrs. Ashworth faced a choice between profitable partnership with Broken Arrow or risky support for Cedar Falls independence. The smart business decision was obvious, which made her actual choice uncertain. "Samuel, is there anything we can do to help the affected businesses?" "Maybe. I've been thinking about this all night, and I have an idea. It's risky, but it might work." He paused, studying her face carefully. "But it would require you to do something that could end your teaching career if it goes wrong." Charlotte felt a familiar flutter of fear, followed immediately by the determination that had carried her through every challenge since leaving Boston. "Tell me." Samuel's plan was audacious and dangerous. If the Territorial Education Commission could be convinced that Cedar Falls represented a successful model of community-based development worthy of official support, their endorsement might provide legal protection against Broken Arrow's intimidation tactics, but it would require Charlotte to stake her professional reputation on a public confrontation with the mining company. The Territorial Commissioners are meeting in Helena next week to finalize their recommendations for education funding. Samuel explained. If you could present Cedar Falls as a success story, prove that community-controlled development creates better educational outcomes than corporate-dominated territories, they might designate us as an official demonstration project. And that would provide legal protection? Territorial demonstration projects receive special status that makes them much harder for private companies to interfere with. But Charlotte, if this backfires, if the commissioners reject your presentation or Broken Arrow successfully discredits your work, I'd lose my teaching position and probably never work in education again, Charlotte finished. I understand the risks. What Samuel didn't say, but what Charlotte understood implicitly, was that failure would also destroy the community's chance for independence. Cedar Falls would become another company town, its people dependent on Broken Arrow's goodwill for their economic survival. The decision came without hesitation. "When do we leave for Helena?" They spent the morning gathering documentation of Charlotte's educational innovations and their impact on student achievement. Jake Morrison's medical clinic project had evolved into a detailed proposal for frontier healthcare that impressed even Dr. Morrison. Tommy Henderson's construction work demonstrated mathematical and engineering skills that surpassed many adult craftsmen. Isabella Santos was now reading English fluently while helping other immigrant children navigate their educational challenges. More importantly, they had evidence that the apprenticeship program was creating measurable economic benefits for the community. Students weren't just learning academic subjects, They were developing skills that would keep local talent in Cedar Falls rather than forcing young people to seek opportunities elsewhere. As word of their plans spread through town, support emerged. From unexpected quarters, Mrs. Kowalski offered to pay travel expenses. Henderson volunteered to document how apprentice programs had improved his business operations. Even Dr. Morrison agreed to provide medical evidence that educated communities experienced better health outcomes than those dependent solely on extractive industries. But the most significant support came from Mrs. Ashworth, who appeared at the PUFA schoolhouse as Charlotte was packing materials for the Helena trip. "Miss Winters," she said, her expression determined, "I've made my decision regarding Broken Arrow's partnership offer. I'm declining their proposal and instead funding a comprehensive development initiative for Cedar Falls, including full financial backing for your presentation to the Territorial Commission." Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude mixed with concern. "Mrs. Ashworth, that's incredibly generous, but the risks are precisely why this is necessary. Broken Arrow's tactics represent everything wrong with unchecked corporate power in developing territories. If communities like Cedar Falls can't maintain independence, then economic development becomes exploitation rather than progress." The trip to Helena took 2 days by stagecoach, traveling through mountain passes that showcased the raw beauty and harsh challenges of frontier life. Charlotte used the journey to rehearse her presentation and refine her arguments for community-based education as a foundation for territorial development. Helena proved to be a bustling territorial capital with government buildings, established businesses, and all the amenities of civilized society. The contrast with Cedar Falls was striking, but Charlotte found herself preferring her small community's intimate scale and collaborative spirit to Helena's impersonal efficiency. The Territorial Commission meeting was held in the Territorial Capitol building, a substantial structure that spoke of ambitions for statehood and permanent government. Commissioner Bradley presided over a panel of 5 officials who would determine education funding priorities for the coming year. Charlotte's presentation began with student work samples that demonstrated academic achievement through practical application. She showed calculations that Tommy Henderson had completed for real construction projects, compositions that Jake Morrison had written about frontier medical challenges, and research projects that immigrant children had completed while mastering English language skills. "Commissioners," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting, "traditional education prepares students for lives they may never live in places they may never go. Community-based education prepares them to solve real problems in the places where they'll actually build their futures." She presented evidence that Cedar Falls students were achieving academic benchmarks while also developing practical skills that contributed immediately to community welfare. The apprenticeship program wasn't just educational innovation, it was economic development that created local expertise and reduced dependence on outside resources. "More importantly," Charlotte continued, "this approach creates citizens rather than just workers. Students learn to think critically about community needs and develop solutions, rather than simply following instructions from distant authorities." Commissioner Bradley raised predictable objections about standardized curricula and measurable outcomes, but his colleagues showed increasing interest in Charlotte's documentation of student achievement and community impact. The decisive moment came when Mr. Davies asked about scalability and replication. "Miss Winters, could this model be adapted to other frontier communities facing similar challenges?" "Absolutely, Commissioner Davies. The principles are universal education should serve local needs while maintaining academic rigor. Students learn better when they see immediate applications for their knowledge, and communities develop more successfully when they control their own human capital development." Charlotte concluded with a formal proposal for territorial demonstration project status, complete with detailed budgets, timeline projections, and measurable outcome criteria. The presentation lasted 90 minutes, followed by another hour of Detailed questions from commissioners who seemed genuinely intrigued by the possibilities she was describing. The commission's decision came 2 days later. Cedar Falls would receive official designation as a territorial demonstration project for community-based education, including funding, legal protection, and requirements for other territories to study their methods before implementing similar programs. The telegram announcing their success reached Cedar Falls the same day Charlotte and Samuel returned from Helena. The entire town gathered at the general store to hear the news, and the celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. "Miss Winters," Mayor Patterson announced during the impromptu festivities, "you've not only secured our educational future, you've protected our entire community's independence." Lily Chun approached Charlotte privately as the celebration was winding down. "You know what this means, don't you? Broken Arrow can't use legal harassment against us anymore. Federal territorial status protects demonstration projects from private interference." Charlotte nodded, but her attention was drawn to Samuel, who stood at the edge of the gathering looking thoughtful rather than celebratory. Later, as they walked together toward their respective homes, Charlotte asked about his subdued mood. "Samuel, you should be pleased. Your plan worked perfectly." "I am pleased. Also amazed by what you accomplished, and ... He paused, searching for words. "Charlotte, when this all started, when we first met at the train station, I thought we were two people making the best of disappointing circumstances. I never imagined we'd end up transforming an entire community." Charlotte understood his amazement. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman fleeing limited options in Boston. Now, she was a territorial education pioneer whose innovations would influence frontier development throughout the West. "We never would have accomplished any of this if everything had gone according to our original plans," she said. "Sometimes the best destinations are ones you never knew you were traveling toward." Samuel stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight that illuminated the mountains surrounding their small community. "Charlotte, I have something to ask you. Something I should have asked weeks ago, but I wanted to wait until we'd both proven we could succeed independently." Charlotte felt her heart quicken, sensing what was coming, but uncertain of her own response. "I love you," Samuel said simply. "Not the woman I wrote letters to, not the partner I thought I needed for my ranch, but the person you actually are. The teacher who fights for her students, the community member who risks everything for her neighbors, the woman who turns disasters into opportunities." Charlotte looked at this man who had become so central to her new life, not through the desperate arrangement they'd originally planned, but through shared challenges and mutual respect earned over time. "Samuel Harrison," she said, surprising herself with the joy in her voice. "Are you proposing to me?" "I'm proposing that we choose each other deliberately this time, based on who we actually are rather than who we thought we needed to be." Charlotte's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." As they stood together in the street of the frontier town that had become their home, Charlotte reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. She had fled one wedding only to find something infinitely more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in terror and desperation was gone, replaced by a woman who had discovered her own strength and built a life of purpose and meaning. And the man who had lost his ranch and his plans had found something better, a calling that utilized his skills while serving his community. They were married a month later in the schoolhouse, surrounded by the students and community members whose lives they had helped transform. Mrs. Ashworth attended, having decided to make Cedar Falls her permanent home and base of operations. Lily Chun provided the wedding feast. Dr. Morrison performed the ceremony as the town's most respected official. But the moment Charlotte treasured most came during the reception, when young Isabella Santos approached her with a carefully written note in English. "Thank you for teaching me that learning is an adventure, not a chore." Charlotte Winters Harrison, frontier teacher and community builder, folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket, knowing she would treasure it forever as a reminder of what was possible when people had the courage to reach for lives they had never dared imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.